Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've spent the last two episodes talking about John Underhill. He was one of the men who did the dirty work of consolidating Puritan power in New England. You remember, we spent some time developing his extended family background. He had been born in England and then moved to the Netherlands at a young age. He would come of age in his new homeland among the Puritan expats. He would marry a Dutch wife. He would have a Dutch daughter. In 1630, he would relocate himself and his family to New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His position was militia trainer, and he was given the rank of captain. Once in New England, it did not take him long to assume more administrative roles within multiple English colonies. He also took part in some brutal military engagements. Ultimately, he was caught up in two scandals that cost him a lot. The Antinomian controversy got him banished. An adulterous affair led to his excommunication. Although he would eventually recover from these scandals, he was never again welcome in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So it was, after serving in various capacities in Connecticut and New Haven, that he moved his family and offered his services to New Netherland, the Dutch colony across the Long Island Sound from Connecticut. That's where we ended last week, and we'll pick up his story this week. Well, the pre-arrival drama that drew him there, the pre-arrival drama that created the Dutch need to invite him. His time in New Netherland was going to be no less active or influential than it had been in New England. Although he officially relocated to New Amsterdam in May of 1644, his service began months earlier. You remember the ugly situations at Mystic against the Pequots, and again at today's Westchester County in New York State, when he attacked a village of Muncie natives and wiped out hundreds of people. His initial service in New Netherland would continue that activity. Remember, he had gotten bored with his administrative roles. He wanted action. Before we get to his activity, much like our overview of Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, a few weeks ago, which helped us to frame John Underhill's background, I want to take some time and develop the immediate atmosphere he was voluntarily entering upon relocation to New Netherland. As you recall, he requested the assignment from the Dutch. We want to look at these events and people groups with our eye on the ultimate goal of piecing together John Underhill's life. He was a pivotal man who's not often mentioned in popular history. And I feel largely because of the role that he played. I mean, he had dirty hands. He had blood-stained hands. By the early 1640s, the Dutch presence and commercial operations had really upset the native landscape. And I want to develop a very rough and quick overview of what had gone on and what was going on at the time of Underhill's arrival, from a non-English perspective, beginning in the opening decades of the 17th century. This will be as quick and thorough as possible to be able to understand what's going on. I mean, we will no doubt revisit this region, or at least some of these people groups, at least 3 times in the next 100 years. I mean, when we cover the Beaver Wars or the Iroquois Wars, I mean, that's when we'll start to get a good dose of the French activity. I mean, don't forget, we are developing this scenario in layers. Ultimately, about 20 years from our current timeline, the French will be the largest existential threat to the English for a century. But we'll also come back to this area when we examine the Quaker settlement and expansion into Pennsylvania, and a third time during the French and Indian War. I mean, maybe even a quick tour during the American Revolution, but that's getting way ahead of our story for right now. So there's 3 main groups I want to focus on. Well, there's actually 5, but 2 are more peripheral. They're only there because of the others. I want to cover their rough geographies, not perfect geography. The goal is to have a working map in our heads to follow the storyline. So if we imagine a map of the current New York State, we can see New York City and Long Island in the south and east. Our Dutch consideration runs primarily from modern New York City up to Albany. It's a pretty straight shot from north to south or south to north. So New Amsterdam, New York City, and Long Island will be the epicenter of our geography. And there were the Mohawk in the north, the eastern tribe of the Great Iroquois Confederacy. They were, at this time, in on-again, off-again conflict with the Mohicans who lived close by. The Susquehannock were farther south. They had an uneasiness about the Mohawks. They were well aware of the danger if the Mohicans fell, which they did. The Susquehannock were a mighty tribe that would truly challenge the Iroquois for a while, but like virtually everyone else, they would be defeated. And sandwiched between the Mohawk and the Susquehannock were the Dutch and the Lenni Lenape. It's quite an interesting group. The Europeans called them the Delaware. Other native tribes called them grandfather. So think about a clock face. In a rough sense, with some population overlap, the Mohawk are near the 12, with the Mohicans close by. The larger concentrations of Dutch and Lenni Lenape, or Delaware, are closer to the middle of the clock face, along with various other groups like the Wappinger Confederacy and the Montauk, and the Susquehannock are at the 6th in Pennsylvania. So the Mohawk at the top, the Susquehannock at the bottom, and everyone else scattered in between. So you have the Delaware in the New York City, New Jersey, kind of southern New England, Pennsylvania region, close to the Dutch. These were a loose confederation of multiple Algonquin tribes. They were an old tribe. Some recognize them as the originator of many of the other Algonquin-speaking people. Thus, their nickname grandfather. One of their subtribes was the Munsee. Another tribe of the area that spoke the Munsee dialect were the Wappinger people. These are both going to be important to our story. The Delaware lived in today's New Jersey, Delaware, southern New York, and eastern PA, and they may have had a population of around 20,000 in the year 1600. They were warriors and diplomats, often helping to negotiate disputes between other groups. When the Dutch arrived in the area, relations had been good. But 3 decades later, by the 1640s, they had broken down. And during Keith's War, which is the time frame that we find ourselves in right now, they fought against the Dutch. They would fracture, be forced to pay tribute, and relocate as a people many times throughout the colonial era. But they survived. Actually, the first treaty that was signed by the United States government after the Declaration of Independence was with the Delaware in 1778 during the Revolutionary War. The promise was eventual Delaware statehood. Tribal Delaware people statehood for assistance against the British. Obviously, that didn't happen. They must have been one of the first treaties that we broke also. But let's back up. This is where a lot of jockeying went on. You have a new set of regional power brokers that we're dealing with. We've moved away from the New England tribes that we've been speaking about. The Narragansett, the Wampanoags, the Nausets, the Massachusetts, the Pequots, for now. But the tribes that we're concerned with right now are farther inland. To the north, as we've said, the Mohawk and the Mohican were regularly warring. And the Dutch had gotten along pretty well with both groups. They had helped to broker a few peace deals between them, which had allowed for the settlement of Fort Nassau near today's Albany. And that was to establish the fur trade. And although the Dutch preferred the Mohican, they had helped to arm the Mohawk to help them fight against the Munsee, again, that smaller subgroup of the Delaware, whose lands they were systematically encroaching on, and the Susquehannock, the power brokers of the South. And that was in 1615. You see the game the Dutch were playing, ingratiating themselves to several peoples that were competing before their arrival and who saw increased competition after their arrival. That could be a dangerous game. Actually, that game helped lead to the situation John Underhill had come to take part in, the conflict that came to be known as Keith's War. In 1614, the Dutch founded New Amsterdam. They assumed control of the area, formerly known as Nouvelle-Anglo-Lamotte. It had been given that name by Giovanni di Verrazzano in 1524 in the name of France. Look at the influence the Italians had. The people from the region of Italy today. John Cabot, he's an Italian guy. He sailed for England. Christopher Columbus, Italian guy. He sailed for Spain. And Verrazzano sailed for France. I find that pretty interesting. Maybe if things had gone slightly differently, the whole world would be speaking Italian right now, or Latin. Anyways, so we've introduced one of the 2 major power struggles that emerged for Dutch trade in the 1620s. It was the northern struggle relative to New Amsterdam, the Mohawk and the Mohican, which by 1628, the Mohawk would emerge victorious, the first of many, many tribes to be vanquished at the hands of the Iroquois. Although there would be future wars between these two as well, the Mohawk were the dominant tribe. In fact, the Mohawk would emerge as the major trading partner with the Dutch. And that arrangement would have consequences for the English a few years later. The French would make their own friends among the natives, who would not appreciate the Iroquois or the English. But that's a storyline to come. It's part of the Frontier Wars and the Beaver Wars. There's a lot at play here in New Netherlands. I mean, these years set the stage for a whole lot of activity to come. The Dutch played a huge role in early colonial life in the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions. Huge. Don't forget, it was the Dutch that first recognized the true value of wampum, which, when we return to Connecticut, will be a very big part of our discussion. In the South, the Susquehannock, motivated in part by their violent past with the Mohawk, warred against the Delaware tribes already trading with the Dutch. I mean, the Delaware are just in a really bad spot. You've got the Mohawk coming down from the north and targeting the Munsee specifically, and the Susquehannock coming up from the south. And everybody wanted control of the Dutch fur trade. And the Delaware were in a sandwich. They were between a rock and a hard place, to be sure. The Susquehannock were watching the situation between the Mohicans and the Mohawk. One more tribal tragedy in this mess came at the expense of the Munsee. They had placed their support behind the Mohicans. I mean, that's easy to understand. The Mohawk were encroaching on their lands, but it was a bad idea. So they suffered from bad geography and a bad pick of allies. And by 1630, the Susquehannock had pushed a lot of the various Delaware groups out of the region. And again, they're gone for now, but not to be forgotten. We'll catch up with the Delaware over and over and over again. It did not take the Dutch long to realize that they had gotten the better end of that deal. The Susquehannock furs were found to be superior to the banished Delaware groups. The Susquehannock were formidable and industrious. They actually established trade with all four European powers in their sphere of influence: the Dutch, the French, the English, and the Swedish. And they were skilled hunters, and the Europeans kept them very busy. Do you remember there's two main objectives to our study of colonial America? The first is to understand how the colonies were ever able to unite. I think it's safe to say that we've seen already controversy even among the supposedly like-minded Puritans. But the second goal is to demonstrate that the natives were not confused and scattered in their efforts, but rather calculating and savvy. We're seeing this play out in the Dutch theater. They were very aware and very deliberate about their surroundings and their actions. The Delaware that were left in this area now were subordinate to the Susquehannock. By 1640, the Susquehannock were at war with the Mohicans. I mean, these guys can't seem to get a break either. The Munsee, part of the Delaware group, are now allies with the Susquehannock. The two superpowers in the region, again, were the Susquehannock and the Mohawk. And the larger Delaware group may have suffered at the hands of the Susquehannock, but the Munsees specifically had suffered at the hands of the Mohawk. I mean, it's one of those like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You see how this plays out with these loosely confederated Indian tribes and groups. They kind of go where it's most convenient for that smaller portion of the group at any given time. So although most of the Delawares were suffering from the Susquehannock, the Munsees actually had attached themselves at this point. And this was good for the Susquehannock because the Munsee were able to secure arms from the Swedes at New Sweden. That's a big deal. By this time, the Dutch were not selling firearms to natives. I mean, they figured out that it might be a great idea if the natives were fighting each other, but that might not be such a great idea if the natives were fighting the Dutch. I mean, they did start this upheaval. At this time, the English made a play for the Mohawk allegiance, away from the Dutch, by selling them firearms. The Mohawks were the power brokers. The English, at a national level, were starting to have issues on a global scale with the Dutch. I mean, what a nasty little cauldron this is becoming. Because of the English provision, the Dutch again began to sell firearms to both the Mohawk and the Mohican. And I will say the Mohawk were fighting on every front at this point. They had ongoing conflicts with the northern tribes that had allied with the French, like the Huron or Ottawa, and the tribes of the south, like all of those that we've talked about today. I mean, actually, it could be that the terror of the lower New England region, the Pequots, had originally been from eastern New York as well, forced to flee the terror of the Mohawk in the middle to latter part of the 16th century. I mean, that's also when they became the terror to their new neighbors. So the Mohawk needed guns for all of their wars. It's really amazing. By the time they were done, the Iroquois would reign supreme in an area that stretched from eastern New York State to the Ohio Valley, up into Canada, and as far south as Virginia and moving westward. I mean, let that sink in. They fought everybody in an ever-increasing circle and won for generations. There are entire people groups that cease to exist at their hands, as we'll see. With this escalation of competition, violence, and the accumulation of money, all the tribes of the New York, New England, and St. Lawrence Seaway were affected, and it got really ugly. In the coming months, well, after we put the New England theater to bed for a while, we'll spend a little time looking at the tornado that was the Iroquois. If you look at a map, they were like the epicenter of what's coming. They're a wrecking ball. They are impressive to everybody except those who get in their way. So are you still with me? As things are heating up among the various native peoples, it finally really hits the Dutch that they are very vulnerable. They're in a dangerous position. They see to it that the Munsee are cut off from obtaining firearms from New Sweden. They have a sister tribe, well, a Munsee-speaking group called the Wappingers. There may have been some overlap. I'll be honest, I can't tell. I get mixed signals depending on what I'm reading. Anyway, the Wappinger tribe spoke the Munsee language. They were affiliated with another whole group of smaller tribes along the Long Island Sound and the general region, the Wappinger Confederacy. Now, don't go to sleep yet. This gets pretty interesting. We've drawn a big circle. Well, we're halfway around. We're about to turn and come full circle, like a boomerang. At the same time the Munsee were cut off from obtaining firearms, the Wappinger Confederacy was having trouble with the Mohicans. Big trouble. What we've laid out so far was stage setting, and now we're entering into the actual theater, a most destructive time for entire people groups. In the winter of 1642-1643, the beginning of the end occurred for the Wappinger Confederacy, which started the whole landslide. I mean, the ground shifted beneath everybody's feet. And incidentally, this is about the time that John Underhill was getting restless, and Anne Hutchinson, you remember Anne Hutchinson, was being harassed by the Puritans. So keep that in mind. So it happened that during that winter, the Mohicans sent a sizable war party to a Wappinger town looking for tribute, and they were rebuffed. And when the violence had ended, almost 20 Wappinger people were killed. But the worst part was that many women and children were taken. I mean, if you can't extract money, take people. I'm guessing this turned into a mourning war exercise. Mourning wars were battles fought where the winner, or the provocateur, would basically steal people from another tribe to help repopulate their own numbers. Since the Mohicans seemed like they had nonstop wars with the big boys, I'm guessing they may have needed to replace some lost people. I mean, children grow to become adults, and women make babies. So if you're lacking, take someone else's. The Wappinger fled to New Netherland for safety. This was a bad move. There had been some bad blood between the Dutch and the Wappinger. It did not take too long for the governor of New Netherland, Willem Kieft, to decide to kill the Wappinger people that had come to seek his protection. Nice guy, right? They're yet another group that could not seem to get a break in the rapidly changing landscape. I mean, this nasty little massacre would escalate into Kieft's war. It would appear the arrival of the Dutch really had upset the apple cart. It should be noted that Kieft acted against his own counsel. He had been warned that this was not a good idea. The fallout was disastrous for the outlying Dutch farms and settlements. In the end, 20 tribes joined the offensive against the Dutch. One of them was a member of the Wappinger Confederacy. They were the Siwanoy, the same tribe that was believed to have killed Anne Hutchinson. I mean, how things come full circle. Anne was another character in our story that just couldn't catch a break. But now at least we have some context or understanding as to why her and her family were killed so brutally. It's Kieft's fault. I'm kidding. But I'm not. This was a precarious situation. The natives had raised 1,500 warriors. The Dutch had only 250 men at Fort Amsterdam. They might have had superior firepower and defenses, but those are not good odds. The one saving grace, or two, for the Dutch was that neither the Mohawk or the Susquehannock joined the fight, and their neutrality kept a whole lot of would-be joiners from joining. Maybe these two groups wanted to see how this would all shake out. Maybe they wanted to watch their rivals take it on the chin. Maybe they just wanted to engage in commerce more than war with the Dutch. I don't know. Neither one of these groups had much to worry about except each other. Maybe they just were not willing to work together. Anyway, they stayed out of the melee, and the smaller tribes paid a tremendous price. So in a mere 30 years, the Mohawk and Susquehannock wrap up dominance for Dutch trade. The most numerous tribe around, the collective Delaware, an old and settled tribe, were dispersed, beaten, or wiped out. What does this have to do with John Underhill? This is the environment that he voluntarily entered into. I mean, we've already seen that he's crazy. He'll get crazier. So the natives were restless. Kieft was at odds with his advisors. John Underhill arrives in New Netherland, and the story unfolds with both military records and eyewitness accounts. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this episode. I hope that you've been able to stay with me. I hope I laid the situation out in a digestible format. I know it's a lot. Listen again if you need to. This was not just an exercise in talking about a lot of forgotten people groups. The consolidation of power and native tribes here will have a tremendous impact on English expansion for years to come. In essence, the Dutch did a lot of the clearing out of what would have been native resistance. They did the dirty work. They did a lot of that dirty work through the actions and determination of John Underhill. There are battles, there are massacres that would occur at the hands of and by the direction of John Underhill. There were people, Dutch people, who vehemently opposed the Dutch treatment of the natives. Their memoirs and remarks are hard to ignore. I think setting the stage today was enough, at least for my head. So the overview of Kieft's War, the actions of John Underhill, and the destruction to come will have to wait for next time. But for this time, I hope our time together has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.